Good afternoon to everybody. It's always a pleasure to be back in the Salt Lake City region. It's a region that I've had the pleasure to really be exploring from an urban design and placemaking and architecture standpoint, and even form-based coding for a little over 10 years. And I won't claim to know it nearly as well as many of you, but it's a really neat place. And I always forget how amazing the views of the mountains are. And it's been a couple of years since I've been here, so it was on a beautiful day like today. The views across the valley are quite stunning. But this topic of missing middle housing is a topic that I'm obviously very passionate about. And what's great about this topic is that if you go into any neighborhood, any city, any part of the country that was built prior to the 1940s, you will find great examples of these missing middle housing types. And this is a local missing middle duplex that I found. It's a historic example. We've been consulting now for the past 4 years with AARP to help spread the word and educate their constituency about the value of walkable living and these missing middle housing choices. But when they interviewed me at some point early on, they asked me a question that I hadn't really thought much about, but it was, well, at what point were you introduced to missing middle housing personally? And so it didn't take me long as I was thinking about it that my great grandmother actually lived in a duplex while I was growing up in a small town called Columbus in Nebraska. If any of you sort of know the geography of Nebraska, but right, that duplex that she lived in was exactly what she needed at that point of her life. It was probably about 650, 700 square feet, a block and a half from many of the services and amenities that she needed. And, nobody ever thought anything about it. It was the perfect type of housing for that point for her in that lifetime. And so many of us have a personal story to tell. Maybe some of you still live in missing middle. You have family members, children, grandparents, best friends that live in these types. So it's a concept that I feel has spread so broadly because it's enabled us to get away from the terminology that we often use in planning and development and architecture that really scares people. And it brings a lot of density, right? Just that word. Can you think of anybody, if you said, well, we're going to come into your neighborhood and we're going to increase the density? Do you think any neighbor or community members are going to be really excited about that? No. And I give applause to Jeff and Sean and the mayor. Had great conversations and presentations about missing middle, and they all passed the test. Nobody used the term density. This is not about increasing density. This is about increasing housing choice. And even the term multifamily, actually, I feel is a term that we probably should put onto the shelf and think about better ways to talk about this. So I'm glad to be here today to sort of do a deep dive because, as Jake said, I was here 8 years ago giving an introduction to missing middle housing sort of just a couple of years after the idea came to us. And now 8 years later, there's good reason to be talking about this, right? Affordability in every corner of the country has gotten very much it's terrible, right? You're one of the fastest growing markets and highest and fastest growing price points in the entire country, but pretty stunning that this was 4 years ago, so it's probably higher now. 30% of all households are housing cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their annual income on just housing. If you put transportation in that, it usually goes above 50%. And if you actually do that study specific to just renters, it's over 55% of households that are housing cost burdened. So this has touched every corner of the country. Even the small town of 20,000 people I grew up in Nebraska is talking about the need for affordable housing just because of all the different increases in costs that have come along in the last couple of years. Right? This used to be a big metro and a big city problem, but we're now working in cities all across Idaho and Montana, Nebraska, Iowa, South Carolina, North Carolina that I'd never even heard of 2 years ago, right? And they're those pressures of a place like a Boise, Idaho becoming unaffordable and people either needing to leave and move somewhere else, or people that are just moving from other places choosing to live in some of these small towns. So it's not just a big city or even a big metro problem. This is really a small town, big city, regional issue. So it's great that we're here talking about this at a county scale. And I love the mayor's call to action of, right, this is a partnership. We all need to play a role. We all need to bring our expertise and be part of this solution, right? And what's happened, and this has been a common theme, right? We all seen this. It's nearly impossible to deliver a single family detached house at an attainable price point, like any market in the country. So a lot of what, about half of our work is with cities and counties, and the other half of our work is with developers. So we're being brought in to developers that have these large communities that were originally entitled for mostly single family zoning, and we're converting that entitlement over to missing middle zoning, because that's what's needed to deliver attainability and the high quality of living that they want to deliver. The other thing that's shifting, and I actually flew here, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I flew here directly from Dallas. I was actually at a master plan communities conference. The biggest topic of discussion was build to rent and how quickly and how dramatically the rental market has shifted. And a large part of it's because, right, if you can't afford to buy that household that would have historically bought a house can't afford it. They also don't want to live in that conventional garden apartment. They want something more sophisticated, a little bit different, a little bit higher quality. And so there's a really big kind of transition happening in the rental market as well that I think this missing middle conversation can plug into. And I'm going to show you an example of a missing middle community that's all for rental that we designed and is being developed in Omaha, Nebraska. And the other great thing is, right, 10 years ago when we created this concept, people could say, oh, it's the planners, it's the architects, it's this big idea, like it's not really reality. But what's happening now is, right, we're at a point where even the ULI has adopted this terminology. They understand the need. They identified it. You should download this report. It's free. It's just called Attainable Housing. ULI published this about 2 or 3 years ago. One of the 3 tools that they recommended to deliver attainability was missing middle housing. So like if ULI is saying that, like this is for real. Like we need to be doing this. We need to be figuring this out, both at a policy and sort of public level, but also development and construction level. And then, right, at the point where an organization like AARP becomes big champions, like 40 million members, like, that, right, there's some momentum behind this. And I know that about 50 of you were lucky enough to get a copy of my book. AARP actually gave money to make sure that book could be full color. And they're really committed to missing middle. They have it on their website. They educate about it. So we're super excited about that partnership. As our population, higher percentage of our population gets older and it gets over that age of 65. And then Jake mentioned the book, and I'm just super excited to finally get a chance to lock myself in a room for a while and actually document my thoughts and put the book down. And it's been selling extremely well, and it's been dubbed the big yellow missing middle book, and it's sort of easy to spot, but hopefully some of you have read it and others will take a look at it. So what is missing middle housing? I'm not going to do the 101 because I know most of you sort of have been thinking about this and talking about this, but I just want to give a really short chronology. So I started my architecture and urban design practice 20 years ago, and our very first project was a master plan. Our client was Santa Barbara County. It was a master plan for Isla Vista, which is the community that's right adjacent to UC Santa Barbara. And I won't tell the full story, but it was the impetus. The Citizen Advisory Committee, sort of the first thing they said to us is we don't want anything more than 17 units per acre. They couldn't tell us why 17 was such the perfect number and why 18 was horrible. And so we backed away from that and said, well, let's go do a walking tour. Let's talk about what you want. And we went to downtown Santa Barbara neighborhoods and saw duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments. And and ultimately came to a really great 2-story C-shaped apartment building on a 100-foot by 100-foot lot, and everybody loved it. And it ended up, I said, well, let my team do some calculations. We did some calculations, and it was 52 units per acre. And so it immediately changed the conversation away from that number that many community members get caught up in, or even as planners we do, into form and scale and type, and who are we planning and building for. That was in 2000. We wrote our first code that had these missing middle types in it. So we've been modifying and adapting this for quite some time. It's not new to us. 2011, I wrote the first documented publication. We created the diagram, and it seems like the diagram was the point where it started really taking off, because almost anybody can look at the diagram and really understand the concept. And then the missingmiddlehousing.com was launched in 2016 in the book last year. And so I love the way that Sean kind of built up to this, and that scale is really important. And I think that's, if you're going to take one message to your council members, to your neighborhood organizations, is that missing middle housing are house scale buildings. So the buildings should never get bigger than house scale that just happen to have multiple units inside of it. And that's a really, really important part of the message and the way to build support for missing middle housing. And it's not that bigger buildings like bigger apartments or bigger condos aren't important and aren't the right answer in some locations. It's just that we need to be thinking about where we need to find opportunities to apply missing middle, sort of these multi-unit house scale buildings in our communities. And this is just down the street. This is in Daybreak. I use this image in almost every presentation I give, because I think this type is one of the great examples. I can show this picture to anybody, and they love it. They love the scale. They love that there's a main entry for one unit and side entries for the other units. They love the character. They love the fact that you could probably walk by this 10 times and not know it was a triplex, unless somebody actually pointed it out that it wasn't just a big house. And so that's just reinforcing that. So to get to house scale, like, we all get caught up in height, right? Height is important. Most of the examples you see of the core missing middle are 2 to 2.5 stories. The upper missing middle, sometimes we create a second category that goes 3 to 4, but it's mostly 2 to 2.5. But the width along the street edge, like how big is that building along the street, really matters. But it also matters how deep the building goes into a lot. Like, all of those elements of scale and form really do matter. And we actually regulate every single one of those specifically in our zoning codes or form-based coding. And so why do we call this missing? Some of Sean's slides were hinting at this sort of for your region. But you can see, like, about I don't know what it was. Nobody's been able to tell me this. And maybe if somebody in the audience finds this out, is about 1979, all of a sudden, like, the percentage of the housing that's being delivered that's missing middle just started reducing dramatically. And you can see that, less than 10% between 1990 and 2013 of the housing that was delivered is missing middle. That's 19 units in a building or below. So that's really upper missing middle and missing middle. And the list of barriers, unfortunately, is long. I wrote an entire chapter on this. It was the first time that I actually got a chance to sit down and do some research and hire a graduate student to help me do some research on this. So there's this really long list. But the first thing that every city needs to fix is the barrier of zoning, because I'll go through this in a little bit of detail, but I would say we've looked at hundreds of codes over the last 5 years, and I would say that about 95% of them fail they actually don't have any of the right metrics to enable missing middle housing whatsoever. But there's a lot of others, because if we all of a sudden, all the cities that are represented in the county, like, suddenly had the best zoning that got adopted tomorrow, the systems aren't in place to just immediately deliver missing middle, right? There isn't a construction industry that's focused on missing middle like there's single family and the big buildings. So that needs to evolve. Sort of lending needs to evolve. So there's a lot of systems that will need to evolve and change to enable this to happen. But because it's such a dire situation right now that we need to figure out a solution. So I'm going to talk first about sort of what cities and counties are doing to remove some of these barriers, and then secondarily what we and other of our colleagues are doing in working with developers to deliver these missing middle housing solutions. So as a very start, so if you look at missingmiddlehousing.com, or if you open, there's an entire chapter in my book that just systematically goes through a full range of the missing middle housing types, from duplex up to courtyard housing. And we give all the metrics that are typical to those housing types to kind of get people to understand. But what we need to start talking about are terminology, right? Shifting away from that density term, the multifamily. We should just be talking about, well, which of these housing types do we want in our cities and towns, right? Do you just want duplexes and cottage courts? Is it okay to have townhouses? And even within townhouses, right? Jeff showed even at Daybreak, there's like, I don't know, there's 20, 30 different variations of townhouses. So which of those forms are okay? Is that third story version okay? Or do you only want the 2-story version? How many in a row? So we really all need to become familiar with the terminology of all of these missing middle housing types, so we can talk about these sort of amongst each other and with our community members and build support for this. So Jake provided this super interesting map, and I'm not going to say that I had a lot of time to study this, but I'm sure this will be a great discussion point as the conversation moves along. But what this map of Salt Lake County demonstrates is, in the purple, is that only 11% of residential zoning allows for significant opportunities for missing middle housing. And you can see there's not a lot of that purple. Like, it's in really concentrated areas. And you can, after the presentation, you can go up to Jake and ask him more about this, but this is not uncommon, right? It's pretty typical, and this is part of what we need to address, is expanding the opportunities, the geographic area where missing middle can apply. And we really need to start with our comprehensive plans, right? I talked about zoning, yes, zoning, but we need really good, really clear policy direction in our comprehensive plans to establish a foundation. So for those of you decision makers in here, when the challenges come, happen, which they probably will for the right kinds of projects, you have that strong policy in place to sort of be your backup, to say, hey, we as a city decided to prioritize missing middle. We decided to prioritize it in these areas. And so, this is what we decided as a city. So we're going to allow these good projects. So just 3 examples and various sizes and types of places that we've worked on that we call it place-based approach to the planning, that all had a really strong missing middle enabling component at the core of these comprehensive plans. I just encourage you to look these 3 up. They're really good examples. And then, if you can do one thing, if you're like a planning director or a staff planner, or if you're a council member that wants to influence this, is the best thing a city can do is any 50-foot lot that exists, I'd say in the right location, maybe not everywhere, should allow a 4-plex. We don't need to get caught up in FAR. We don't need to get caught up in density. Just say, that's a great lot width that this 4-plex, right, house scale, 2 units on the bottom and 2 units on the top, fits on. It's a quick fix. Give your zoning code a test. Does your zoning code allow a 4-plex on a 50-foot wide lot, regardless of what the depth is? So just a quick overview of like where can you start thinking about geographically where to apply missing middle in your planning efforts. And first and foremost, right, there's small individual lot infill, right? Especially near a transit station, near existing infrastructure, near services and amenities. You definitely need to be enabling missing middle even at, it doesn't need to be a Daybreak scale, right? We need to be thinking about enabling this at the Daybreak scale and at that 50-foot wide lot scale, right? So, and that's really brain surgery, right? It's a really nuanced approach that we need to be thinking about. Secondary corridors, yesterday I was in Draper for the very first time. I was in a car driving down Front Street. Actually saw some great historic missing middle examples. I saw some beautiful old brownstone mansions. Like, that's the kind of secondary corridor that I feel could be a great application and place to apply missing middle housing. Transitions from higher intensity corridors, right? Every city has a strategy. We're going to allow the bigger buildings in this location on this corridor. Well, hey, guess what? Similar to what Daybreak's doing in terms of transition and scale, it's a great idea to create areas and adopt zoning for missing middle as a transition from those larger apartment buildings into single family home neighborhoods. And then thoughtful transit-oriented development. This is actually the North Berkeley BART station, if you're familiar at all. It's actually in my neighborhood. And we were hired by the city to do a study of, could we meet the state's minimum density requirements and still integrate missing middle scale buildings at the edges that front onto single family neighborhoods. So you can see here, 4 to 5 stories in the middle, transitioning into multiplexes at the edge. And we were actually able to achieve, I think it was 82 units per acre over the whole site with a thoughtful approach of transition and variety of types. And then there's grayfield sites, that 30, 40, 50, 60 acre dying mall, dead mall, dying strip mall. Great opportunity, especially in these more suburban communities, to think about maybe some bigger buildings along the corridors and they transition down to missing middle at the edges. And then, existing single family neighborhoods, a big question mark. And this is the big political touch point. I'm not saying that every single family neighborhood and every single family zoned lot should be sort of changed to allow missing middle. But I think cities should very thoughtfully and in a very detailed way sort of assess where in the city they want to prioritize missing middle. And in some instances, especially near the light rail, for example, it may make sense to transition some of those single family lots into this missing middle housing scale. And this is another great historic example from the Avenues neighborhood in Salt Lake. So some of the planning and zoning barriers. Okay, this is a quiz. Just what do you think the density of this building is? Just yell it out, anybody. 32? I heard over here, I didn't hear what the number was. 40? Anybody else? The Price is Right. Am I doing the Price is Right? Anybody else want to guess? $1. Too low. So on one of my missing middle walking tours, I often do this for APA or CNU or ULI, any of these organizations. This is Midtown Sacramento, right? One of those types you can't help but really like. It's 2 stories. This is also on about 100 foot by 100 foot lot. And inevitably, a young woman came out the front door and she was, and we often talk to them. She really loves living in this apartment, been here for a long time, doesn't plan on moving. We do some math. We count the meters, we count the doorbells. And this apartment generates a density of 90 units per acre. And I can guarantee there's not a single comprehensive plan or zoning code in the entire country that allows 90 units per acre, but caps the height at 2 or 3 stories. So here's the disconnect. This is why we're not getting smaller, more thoughtful missing middle building types. The reason it generates that kind of density is because the units are 500 square feet. And so the problem with density-based zoning is it treats every unit, regardless of size, exactly the same. If it's a 3,500 square foot unit, that's a unit. If it's a 500 square foot unit, that counts as a unit in your density. So that's why we just encourage get rid of density. Take it out of your zoning, take it out of your comp plan, and let's get more creative about this. We often find that, so we were hired by the city of Austin, Texas, really big city geographically, to assess their zoning. They didn't have a single zoning district in the entire city of Austin, Texas that enabled missing middle housing. It jumped immediately from, they allowed a duplex in their single family zone, but it jumped immediately to allowing 50-foot tall, unlimited size buildings in the next zoning district up. So that's pretty common as well, that the missing middle zoning districts are actually missing completely. So this was my message earlier, just be really direct about what you want. This is a typical example of, the zoning district can be called whatever you want. It can be called missing middle, it can be called mixed housing. But this particular one, we just say, these are the range of missing middle types that are allowed in this zoning district. it doesn't need to be any more difficult than that. And these are the minimum lot sizes for each of those types. And that's what I encourage. Don't let the developer guess what you want. Just tell them what you want and what should be allowed. And this is a critique I have of like the town center zone or the housing overlay zone. It's often too broad. It's well intended, but it's too unpredictable for developers really to come in and deliver missing middle is what we've found, especially for the smaller builders who are most likely to deliver this. Then the metrics are wrong, right? Maximum densities are usually too low. Minimum lot sizes are too large. Setbacks are too large. We have this system I'll talk a little bit more about where we actually assess zoning codes and do these graphs to show where the zoning districts, which of the missing middle type zoning districts allow and which they don't allow. So this is an interesting, the metrics are often very misleading too, and I think that's right, a repetitive message here, is if you take this same fourplex, okay, we start with a 75 by 50 foot lot, and then you take that exact same building, same number of units, and the lot just incrementally gets bigger, and you analyze the metrics. The density doubles and the FAR doubles. Sorry, as the lot gets smaller, the FAR doubles and the density doubles, but the building stays the exact same size. So it just shows the lack of predictability that you can actually get with a density and FAR based system. It's not controlling the form at all. So it's just we need to be thinking about this a little bit more creatively and a little bit differently. I'm just going to admit, I don't like this type. It's the tuck under townhouse with the big garage door on the front. And I just say, you may have to allow this, and it's okay to allow this in specific parts of your town, but it's bad for walkability. And it usually doesn't deliver attainability because they're usually fairly big units. And so just be really thoughtful, because if you allow this is what most builders will give you. I'll just say that. So I see this all over the country. And then my least favorite type is the slot home. And it's two rows of townhouses turned perpendicular to the street. And I'll just say your region has a bad case of slot homes. And you need to figure out a way. I know I'm pretty sure the city's changing their zoning. Just as you're thinking about enabling missing middle, decide if you want this. And if you don't want it, the reason there's pushback is because it takes a 3-story volume that basically goes from the front of the lot to the rear of the lot. So there's usually issues with the neighbors on all 3 sides. And it usually doesn't deliver attainability because they're bigger units. And we've done economic analysis in a number of cities, and they're feasible, right? Developers can build them feasibly. They're feasible in a pro forma, but they usually don't deliver attainability. So you just have to be thoughtful. And I think they actually can erode the quality and character of a walkable neighborhood pretty quickly. And let's talk about mapping. There's an exercise, I don't know, maybe Jake's done this or one of the other Salt Lake County staff, but every town should do this. What percentage of your town or city or county allows for only single family zoning? This was a big mistake every city made that sort of led us to the problem we're in. The typical US city has about 80 to 85% of residential land that only allows single family, right? So we need to chip away at it. That doesn't need to be 0%, but right, we need to find more opportunities to deliver missing middle. We're currently working in San Jose, California, and they're one of the biggest offenders here. It's 94% of their residential land is zoned only for single family. And you can imagine a city that's right next to Silicon Valley and is going to have Google's new campus. You know how much a little bungalow costs in San Jose, California? Like a couple $1 million for a 1920,000 square foot bungalow. So I will say that I'm glad you're talking about this now, because I feel like regions like Salt Lake City, if they don't do something about this, will be the Bay Area in 10 years. That's my prediction. If something is not done, it'll be that bad. So it's kind of a tip. So if your zoning code allows just allows 5 units of any size. You won't get 5 small units like this. You need to incentivize the small units. So what we like to do in our codes is say any unit under, let's say 750 square feet counts as half a unit. And that's the kind of state legislation that enabled most of the great pocket neighborhoods that have been built in the Seattle region that you see, like the pocket or the cottage company. And so like this is a sort of creative thinking, incentivize small, treat it as half a unit, both in terms of if you're calculating density, impact fees, incentivize that. So the other thing is, why not? So the yellow box in all 4 of these examples is the exact same height, width, and depth. It's the container. So why not write a zoning code that says it's the box that we're worried about, the size, but you can either do 1 unit, 2 units, 4 units, or 8 units within that same box. Because this 8-unit, this 8-plex is going to deliver way more attainability than any of these other examples. So just a seed to plant. It seems like a lifetime ago that I wrote a book on form-based coding. it's another good resource. It's a little less readable than the Missing Middle book, but I just encourage you to look at that, or the Form-Based Code Institute has a very great website with free information I just encourage you to take a look at. Unfortunately, a lot of the form-based coding efforts in the last 10 years have actually been very ineffective. I'm going to fess up that we actually see it a lot, that we get calls from a city, oh, we adopted a form-based code 7 years ago. We're not getting any development. What's wrong? And so we kind of go in and do a diagnosis. So we need to be really thoughtful about this and just think about new tools. Form-based coding is not the only tool, but let's be thoughtful about it. How many of you have heated conversations about parking in your communities? All right, there's more than that. You're half asleep now. So, right, more parking equals larger lots plus fewer units plus equals higher prices, right? It's pretty straightforward. Like we need to tackle the parking conversation as we tackle the missing middle conversation. And we've done extensive studies, and we often plug these into pro formas, working with an economist or working with scenario modeling of the yellow building has 1-bedroom units in a 4-plex. The blue building has 2-bedroom units in a 4-plex. And it just shows the lot sizes that are required. Minimum lot size with no parking, 1 space alley loaded, 1 space front loaded. And we've done this for 2 spaces per unit. At 2 spaces per unit, most of these types are absolutely not feasible economically or even just spatially. And right, you can run the numbers. I just encourage you, have an economist run the numbers of what's the impact on cost for that additional parking, because it's really important. My message is one of my messages is you can't be for attainable housing and also be for high parking requirements. Like you can't have both. You need to pick. Which is more important to you? Do you want great spaces for cars, or do you want spaces for people to live in? Like, I think that's a really important part of the conversation. And then more and more of what we've been doing has included an economist, right? Because we can't just say, well, we think the 4-plex is going to, deliver attainability where a single family home might not. But what we find in working with economists is, hey, it actually needs to be a 6-plex, or those units need to be 600 square feet, not 800, or 1,000, not 1,400. And so I just encourage you, as you go through your planning exercises, like make sure you run the numbers. Partner with your development community, run those numbers. Identifying barriers. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, we've developed a methodology where we call it a missing middle scan and a missing middle deep dive, where we work with the city and their GIS data to identify where they should prioritize missing middle based on a series of criteria that we've developed. And then we dive deep into their comprehensive plan, their area plans or neighborhood plans if they have them, and their zoning, and we say, here's the list of barriers for missing middle. This is what you need to change. And so we kind of jump in, give these recommendations, and oftentimes their staff sort of latches onto that and implements those recommended changes to enable missing middle. So this is in Greenville, South Carolina. It's both a county as well as the city of Greenville. And if you haven't heard of Greenville, it's been in the press a lot because it may be one of the few places that is growing faster than the Salt Lake City region. Like the New York Times had it as one of like the top 5 places to move your business and to move to middle of last year. So it's growing. And what was really interesting about this is the development community actually paid for this exercise because they felt that they needed to participate and support this and actually identify those barriers and be supportive of it and work with the city and the county to make it happen. And so I'm not going to jump into the detail, but these are just some of the comparisons we do of identifying which types the existing zoning districts are or are not allowing based on this spectrum that we have in our database. We sort of systematically work through sort of the zoning and the policies. And we do this really interesting graphic assessment where it's hypothetically, it's the allowed building envelope. It's what the developer would actually likely do, the worst case scenario that the zoning allows. And then we kind of do like, what's the best case missing middle scenario? And we compare the 3 of those. And just as an example, and this is not uncommon, this is a 60-foot wide lot. And the zoning district said, if you're going to build single family, your side setbacks are only 5 feet. But if you're going to build multifamily, that scary multifamily, your side setback's 25 feet on both sides. So it leaves a 10-foot wide development strip right in the middle of the lot. Does anybody think that's feasible? Nobody's going to build a 10-foot wide building. And so it's like that mental jump of like everything except single family is going to be big and scary. So this is like where missing middle can really fit into that. And we sort of back into, okay, well, this is what we really want to allow, that 4-plex or 5-plex. And then what is your zoning, what changes need to happen in your zoning to actually enable that? Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. And we're working with the city of Iowa City to look at a targeted growth area that they identified in their comprehensive plan and doing this area plan and form-based code to allow missing middle in that district. And it just has 4 new missing middle enabling zoning districts. And then I wanted to just show this because it was one of the more interesting projects we've done in the last sort of 5 to 7 years. It was Beaufort County, South Carolina, just because it's a very atypical kind of place, a lot of really amazing rural contexts. And we actually created a shared countywide zoning code template that Beaufort, the city of Beaufort, the county of Beaufort, and several other jurisdictions actually shared. We're actually doing that in Marin County right now. So I know there was a shared code template at some point in this region, or I don't know if it was just the city, but just something you should probably think about because there's no reason every city should have to create their own tool. I think it really should be a coordinated effort. Some private sector case studies, and so this is the less technical stuff. So this is actually the more interesting graphic, good photos, but this is a great project called Cottages on the Green. Like, is anybody in here, if you showed that to community members, do you think they would be against that? Like, that's pretty charming, right? Like, this is usually one of the favorite types amongst community members. It's a pretty great type. It's one of the case studies in my book. It's called Cottages in the Green. It's built in Greenwich, Rhode Island by one of our colleagues, and it's about 0.85 acres, 15 units. It's about 18 dwelling units per acre. So that's actually, I mean, in some cities, that's actually considered high density, right? 18 units per acre outside of like TOD areas and such. But I think that, as another takeaway is make it a priority to enable this type in your community. You could do a cottage ordinance, sort of a standalone cottage ordinance. That would be a great way to enable this type. So the next project is this is a project that we've been working on for the last 4 years, and I'm super excited about it because it's completely redefining what Class A multifamily can be, utilizing missing middle housing types. And I think when I was here I think I was last year, like 3 or 4 years ago, this was just an idea on paper. So there are about 150 units built. 50-acre project. What's built there in that photo is about a little over 20 acres, 742 units, The density is a little bit deceiving because the units are big. They're about 1,200 square feet average, but there's also about a 10-acre piece that's undevelopable right in the middle that's factored into that. But the part of the key to this is our client was okay and the city was okay with one parking space off street per unit. And this is in suburban Omaha, Nebraska. This is not in downtown Chicago or San Francisco or Berkeley, California. This is suburban metro Nebraska. And so it's what you see here, though, is that one of the things we really encouraged our client to do that I was a little bit surprised he let us do, there's a neighborhood main street that delivers this walkability we talk about. It's a townhouse over a flex space that's about 24 feet wide by 40 foot deep. That's a great incubator for small business. So now there's a pizza shop, there's a yoga studio, and there's soon to be a coffee shop. So that's really great amenities and walkability for this neighborhood. But the majority of the neighborhood is sort of a triplex up to eightplex. So the initial idea, those of you who heard me present 3 or 4 years ago here, was that the building that looks like a mansion, right? Our client loved those early turn of the 20th century mansions. He's like kept showing us pictures, but that building happens to have 7 units inside of it. Like that was the idea. And then let's create 7 or 8 versions of that idea. And let's create a neighborhood as opposed to creating a multifamily project. And so these are just some of the images of the original designs. And you can see this looks and feels and behaves just like a single family walkable neighborhood. It just happens to be, these are all multiplexes. There's not a single family building in this entire project. And they're renting before they're completed. The challenge with this, just as most of these communities, is it's been so successful that the prices keep creeping up, right? Low supply and high demand equals, unfortunately, high prices. But an important part of this is, right, a connected street and block network. And you won't get apartment builders to do that unless you require them to do that. That's a really important part of this approach. Narrow tree-lined streets, we talked about this for those of you who were on tour at Daybreak. Really important part of this. You have to get your engineering departments to agree to have narrow pedestrian-oriented streets by right. It needs to be by right. It can't be by negotiation. Because does this look like a parking lot to anybody? No, this is the parking lot. There are no parking lots in this project. There is an alley with garages behind, and then there's parking on the street. And our client really likes that. If it's the developer that's always crunching the numbers, because he's not having to build that big parking lot, and he's giving that street to the city. And the city's maintaining the street, not him. So all of a sudden there's another incentive for him. If he's doing this great project, let's give him an incentive and do this. And by the way, the person who lives in that unit right there on that porch loves to park right here instead of parking in a big parking lot and walking across the parking lot and leaving their car someplace they can't observe it and getting it broken into occasionally. So the way the buildings address the street is really important. You know, this what we call frontage, transition from the public and the sidewalk into the private. Hierarchy of streets, just another view and down one of those streets. And right, this is like a mix. This is a 5-plex. These are the live works with the flex space. That's a 4-plex. Just a really nice variety. And so Omaha had some of the lowest rents we've worked with. $1.24 a square foot was the top of the rental market. So this isn't being done in a market that's like $2+ per square foot. This is $1.24 per square foot is what our client used to run as pro forma for this. But you can see every color is a different number and a different type. You can see the variety of the housing types that are being delivered, and they're really quality and sense of place. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio from the lowest $800 a month for that 1-bedroom unit here, $3,000 for the townhouse. That's really unusual to have that ratio in the bottom rent and the top, but it's great to have that in terms of attainability. And then this is just a glimpse of the alleyways. You know, you can see this in other places here. Daybreak has a lot of ADUs. You know, what's really interesting about like this ADU in particular, it lives much like a single family detached house because there's nobody on any side of you and there's nobody above you. So it's actually a really desirable unit that our clients renting, and just a really high quality place for more people to call home, I think is really the objective here. And I just want to encourage you to go out and look at this Daybreak Muse project that we designed for Holmes Homes. And this is a for sale product type, housing type. And I really like this. We ended up splitting 2 larger blocks into 4 smaller blocks with this pedestrian-only walkway. And the units ranged in size from about 970 square feet to 1,400 square feet. And that was, at the time, it was 15% smaller than sort of what was being delivered there. And they started at 185,000, went up to 220,000. Now, they went up in later phases in cost, but it achieved its goal that Holmes Homes had of delivering attainable priced housing for that first time buyer. And I'll say I ran into the woman yesterday who bought the very first unit when I was walking through the space, and she was thrilled to be part of this community and the strong sense of place it was creating. And just because it's attainable doesn't mean it needs to be low quality. That's a common theme here. Those units have double-story living spaces, really thoughtful designs like breakfast nooks. And this is just an example of that same Muse home that our client in Nebraska built as a rental product, and it performed as a rental product super, super well as well. So there's a lot of adaptability. One last example before I drop off. This is an extreme example, but I want to show this because, number one, this is the project I'm most excited about that we've been working on. And number two, it just shows like the extreme that a lot of the development community at the upper end of being innovative is going. And this is a car-free community in Tempe, Arizona, that will be the largest car-free community in the country when it's built. When it's finished next year. Sorry, first phase will be finished next year. Vertical construction has started, but this has gotten a ton of press. You may have read about it. It's been in pretty much every major publication. But this is a 16-acre site, will generate about 640 units. You can see, if you can read a master plan, you can see that they didn't just remove cars from an otherwise conventional project. They said, we want you to innovate in terms of product type, and we want you to innovate in terms of placemaking. And so it's a very organic, almost medieval sort of neighborhood that we're making that is responding to the harsh desert climate that Tempe, Arizona has, with small courtyard spaces, narrow paseos. It's going to be unlike anything that's been built in the Phoenix metro, and really unlike anything that's been built in the United States, at least in the last couple hundred years. And so this is just an image of one of the interblock courtyards that are part of the courtyard housing system that we created as part of this project. I'm super excited about this. Once again, they're getting creative, not just taking away cars, they're also creating partnerships with mobility companies. Bird Electric Scooters is a partner, City Car Share is a partner, the Regional Transit Agency is a partner, and they're going to deliver either free or highly reduced sort of mobility use of those with those companies for all of their community members. And if you're wondering if there's demand for this, because I remember the Wall Street Journal published the first publication, there's 130 units in the first phase, 150 people have given deposits, and there's over 3,300 people on a waiting list. And over 50% of the first phase renters are moving from out of the state to live in this project. So you can just say yes, there's demand, people want this. There's a really interesting comparison. This project was entitled on that same site, and this is the cul-de-sac project on same scale. This didn't pencil out because it required 2 7-story parking structures that didn't pencil out. But this penciled out, and it generated, let's see, I think it was it's only 40 units different in terms of total yield. So it's really interesting to make that comparison. If you strip that parking out, what can you do? So that's just a construction photo. So a couple of concluding thoughts. Chris Nelson, who many of you probably know, he was here for a number of years before he moved to Arizona, but he did a chapter in my book, did some great research on market demand and housing demographic shift. But he showed that, right, 62% of homes built between now and 2040 would need to be missing middle housing in walkable locations to actually meet the demand. So, right, we know all of a sudden we're not going to shift that quickly and be able to do that, but that's the extreme nature of the demand. I really feel strongly that modular is going to be part of the solution. And we're partnering with a great group out of Buena Vista, Colorado called Fading West. They're creating modular townhouses and small lot, single family detached. We're creating communities, but we're also going to likely develop an entire missing middle product line with these guys that can be delivered to various parts of the country. We did a great research project with the National Association of Home Builders. I just encourage you to take a snapshot of this and look it up. It's a really great document that we analyzed zoning codes in, I think it was something like 40 different municipalities and how it enabled missing middle housing. So, if you want a lot of free content and want to learn more, you can go to missingmiddlehousing.com. I'm really excited about this work we've been doing with cities and counties on these missing middle scans. So I'm just planting the seeds. If any of you are ready to do this, don't hesitate to reach out, because we're having a really good time doing this and feel really good about the results. And so, right, as the mayor said, right, we all need to step up. Like, we're at a point where this housing situation has become really quite dire, actually, and we need a lot of different tools. We need a lot of different sort of expertise, whether you're a decision maker, a planner, a realtor, a builder, a master plan developer. Like, it's going to take really every single one of you all and your different skill sets to effectively address this housing problem. And missing middle housing can absolutely be an important part of that solution. Thank you.